Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. Let's now turn to escalating tensions in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia said 2 of its oil stations were attacked on Tuesday, 2 days after the alleged sabotage of its oil tankers. The attacks follow the U.S. deployment of naval forces in the region. Tensions have risen since the U.S. withdrew from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The Iranian foreign minister accused Washington of escalating the situation, while the U.S. Secretary of State said the U.S. did not seek war. So what now? Before we get down to the discussion, take a look at this background.
Acrimony among major powers casts a long shadow over the Middle East. Saudi Arabia said armed drones struck 2 of its oil pumping stations on Tuesday, 2 days after the suspected sabotage of its oil tankers near the United Arab Emirates. The U.S. military said it's braced for what it calls possible imminent threats to U.S. troops in Iraq from Iran-backed forces. Since early this month, Washington has been trying to cut Iran's oil exports to zero and to beef up its military presence. Iran is defiant. On Tuesday, the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has met with its Indian counterpart Sushma Swaraj in New Delhi. India has agreed to stop buying Iranian oil on the back of renewed U.S. sanctions.
Well, unfortunately, the United States has been escalating the situation unnecessarily. We do not seek escalation, but we have always defended ourselves.
Over the weekend, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has asked the country's political factions to come together in the face of unprecedented U.S. pressure. The president's call for unity followed U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's trips to Europe and Russia. European leaders have urged the U.S. to exercise maximum restraint and to avoid military confrontation with Iran. Tensions in the Middle East were on the agenda of another meeting on Tuesday in Sochi, Russia.
We fundamentally do not seek a war with Iran. We're looking for the regime to simply stop conducting assassination campaigns throughout Europe, to cease their support of Hezbollah that threatens interests all across the Middle East.
However, this month, the U.S. has deployed more forces to the Persian Gulf, including a carrier strike group and B-52 bombers. Tehran also listed all U.S. troops in the Middle East as terrorists. Besides withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, the Trump administration also carried out policies that are unpopular in the region. In late 2017, Washington recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and just 2 months ago, it signed a declaration recognizing the Israeli annexation of the disputed Golan Heights region.
For more on the U.S. policy in the Middle East, in Washington, D.C., we have Ivan Eland, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty with the Independent Institute. In Tehran, Gambar Nadari, a political analyst and columnist with Kayhan International newspaper. And in our Beijing studio, Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Going to you, Mr. Nadari, about the latest situation regarding Iran's security. How much danger is there in a war, and what do you make of the accusations that others said about Iran's destroying the so-called Saudi Arabia tankers?
Well, Tian Wei, this is a good question, and everybody is asking the same question here. What is going to happen? Who is behind these attacks? What is Iran's options on the table? But will I tell you, I'll make you one thing very absolutely clear. I talked to the commander of the Iranian army today. He wasn't walking along the shores of the Persian Gulf, overseeing the troop deployments or military gear, being dispatched to the shores of the Persian Gulf. No, he is here in the capital. He knows very well that there is no war between Iran and the United States, and Iran is not going to escalate the situation. That said, I think those who are going to benefit from this escalation are also the ones that have tried to attack these unfortunate unfortunate oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. So it is not Iran. These accusations against Iran are baseless. If you are in doubt, still in doubt, you should ask the military commanders of the British Army. They also made it absolutely clear that Iran or its proxies in the region pose no threat whatsoever to the United States and its allies in the region.
So, Mr. Eland, of course, the natural question goes to you. Is the U.S. trying to make trouble in the region and then, in that name, trying to so-called calm down the situation?
Well, I think yes. I think John Bolton, who's the National Security Advisor, and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, are both very anti-Iran. And even Allied and U.S. intelligence analysts think that the most aggressive moves have been made by the United States in the past year, not Iran. And of course, as was mentioned, a British official who's at the Pentagon yesterday said he saw no increase in Iranian threats in Iraq or Syria, which is what the U.S. is claiming, that the Iranians are threatening U.S. forces there.
So, Mr. Eland, in other words, do you think you would trust Secretary Pompeo when he said that the United States was not trying to escalate the tensions in the region? Is he trustworthy given his earlier political stance?
Well, if they're not, then they're playing a dangerous game, I think, because some people here in Washington think they're just doing this to get the Iranians to behave, but of course the Iranians, as the intelligence people say, even U.S. intelligence people say that the Iranians really haven't been doing as much as the U.S. aggressively. So I think Pompeo is not very believable. The other reason for this may be the fact that that as with the China tariffs, Trump just cares about his political base and shoring that up, and it's very Iranian, anti-Iranian. However, a lot of his base does not want another war in the Middle East, and of course, any war in the Middle East would once again go down the road of the U.S. getting distracted. Even Trump's national security plan, his defense strategy, says that he wants to orient U.S. more toward the great powers rather than the Middle East. But yet his advisors, I think, are dragging him toward another war in the Middle East.
So, Mr. Yang, to you, of course, an important question, that is, now the U.S. Secretary of State just met with the Russian president, and both sides seem to be rhetorically talking about common consensus, or at least some common ground compared to previous times. So how much now shall we understand about Pompeo's statement, and also the escalating of crisis in the region, I mean in the Middle East, of course, regarding Iran? Will the latest interaction work as a bumper towards further danger?
Well, firstly, I don't think Russian and American consultations at a foreign ministry level will produce substantive results, both on the Iran crisis or the crisis in Middle East in general, simply because of the sharp differences between Moscow and Washington, D.C.
Explain, please.
Well, on Iran, on Syria, U.S. and Russia stands totally different position, supporting the different forces. And any discussions or changes between the two people can solve or narrow down the gap of the positions. And secondly, strategic purpose or strategic goal on the Middle East from the two powers are quite different. And at the most, the two sides can do something like crisis prevention or problem control. That is the most. And secondly, I do believe U.S. don't want to see the escalation of the current situation, especially after the attack of the Saudi Arabia's oil tankers. But the problem is Donald Trump is conducting a American unilateral doctrine again, just like Junior Bush did. many years ago.
Yeah.
The difference between Junior Bush and Donald Trump is only want a war or don't want a war. But the nature of the unilateral by the American is the very same. That will lead, that will put the situation in Middle East in a very dangerous direction.
I see. Mr. Nazari, of course, Iran will be the prime target if any further escalation of tension in the region. Now, from Iran's perspective, how do you see the latest incident of Saudi tankers being destroyed and attacked? And meanwhile, how will that have an impact on the overall oil situation of your region? What would that mean for Iran particularly?
Well, these were false flag operations specifically designed to encourage the United States Army to attack Iran on the pretext of supporting its allies in the Persian Gulf. That's the end of it. There are many accusations against Iran, but Iran is not going to benefit from these new escalation. Why? Because from the first day of these, spat, Iran made it absolutely clear that it just wants to export oil to international markets. Iran also gave 60 days deadline for Europe in order to introduce this so-called Instex financial channel to get back the money, to get the money that it sells through its oil. That's it. So Iran is not seeking escalation. Iran is not stupid enough to attack its neighbors in the region. And before even this incident happened, Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif sent a letter to the regional countries and calling on them to come to the negotiating tables in order to sign a contract, an amity deal that says they are going to cooperate with each other with regard to the security of the region. So Iran is not seeking confrontation or hostility. Iran doesn't want to antagonize its allies or its neighbors, and of course the United States. But they are trying to find a way to escalate the situation. If you are asking me, there has to be a fall guy, and that is going to be John Bolton. He miscalculated Iran's reaction. He miscalculated the power of opposition in Venezuela, and he's definitely going to pay the price this time.
Well, whether he's going to pay the price or not, Mr. Eland, you and I probably could all remember that during the Bush administration, Bush Jr., of course, there were a lot of internal discussions, if not fights, among the administration officials of whether or not there's a war in Iraq, and eventually it happened. Of course, some of the names then are already become some of the names now in the current administration. Having said that, though, Mr. Eland, let me ask you about this. Do you compare the situation then and now as similar? Will the hawkish voices in the administration be able to get an upper hand given the current political environment in Washington and the difficulties personally President Trump himself has in terms of his family and his personal behaviors and the investigations related to them?
Well, I think that the president ran on a campaign of, staying out of unnecessary wars, particularly in the Middle East. And I think he has that general inclination. However, he's responsible for appointing these very hawkish anti-Iran people, Bolton in particular. And yes, Bolton was involved in the Iraq fiasco, and we're seeing some of the same things. I think the exaggeration of intelligence about what the particular adversary, back then Saddam Hussein, in this case the Iranians, the threat that they pose, that threat is being exaggerated. And even U.S. intelligence and allied intelligence officials are quoted in the New York Times today saying that they're exaggerating Iran's behavior. And even if Iran is, these could be false flag operations, but even if Iran is attacking these tankers or the pipeline or whatever, the United States pulled out of the agreement first and has been trying to strangle Iran's economy by shutting off oil and resuming other sanctions, and also declaring the Iranian Revolutionary Guards a terrorist organization. Now, to your second question was, would he get into a war because of his domestic difficulties? That's always a danger of any leader around the world if they run into domestic trouble, and Trump has from the beginning of his. But in this case, I think the public might be quite skeptical, especially after the Iraq War. I'm not sure that this would be a popular war, and I also think that Iran may turn out to be a much more formidable adversary than the depleted forces of Iraq were in Saddam Hussein, because if you remember, we had 2 wars with Iraq. The first war pretty much depleted Saddam's military, and the second one was just a cakewalk, except for when we got to the guerrilla part, and then it became a disaster for the U.S. But I mean, it could happen again, and they're some of the same people doing it.
Yeah, but the most important thing, Mr. Yang, is that JCPOA 2015 agreement, the U.S. withdrew from it. And then the U.S. said, the current administration said, well, then we might not want to that involved in the Middle East, so let's withdraw from that part of the world. But then it becomes, once again, interested into the region and begin to play up the so-called danger as it sees it, or rhetorically would like to describe it. How should we see the back and forth, very uncertain, shall we say, focus of the current administration toward the Middle East? Is it lack of experience, or is it just a product of convenience, or is it just a so-called global map it is looking at, while picking up trade wars with this country and that one, fighting geopolitical issues with others? Well, maybe something going on over here. So how should we understand what's going on here, and so that to deal with it, Mr. Yang?
Well, what you have described the situation facing the Trump administration exactly described the paradox facing the American administration, simply because the uncertainties stem from the contradictions between their global strategy focuses and the regional Middle East focuses. Globally, Trump has put Russia and China as the top threats. And in general, Trump wants to withdraw from Middle East so that he can intensify their forces in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Logic greatly, perfect. But in reality, they made the opposite efforts in the Middle East. They want to withdraw, but before they withdraw from the Middle East, they have made more troubles that prevent the U.S. from withdrawing. So that's the root of the contradiction and the paradox.
Well, I'm sure we're going to see more after effects of this paradox for weeks and probably months to come. But for now, I want to thank the 3 of you, gentlemen, for being with us for this discussion. Ivan Eland coming from the U.S., Mohammad Zarif coming from Iran, and Yang Xu here in China. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From Mi Tianwei and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and the world.